actually my first time being at the conference, finally, so I'm really glad to be here. I guess we shouldn't waste any time. We should get right in for our presenters, and going just in the order we have here. Are we missing something? The first one. So I see you're all from Georgetown University. And, I'm already nervous. I went to Boston College, and so it's kind of interesting to me. I don't know what the Jesuit comparative perspective at this point is in various schools, but it feels familiar, and so that's nice. The first presenter, as been mentioned, is not here, not coming either, apparently. Okay, so check out her work in the program. But then we do have with us Toby Hickson, who studied comparative literature as an undergraduate at Stony, and is currently a master's English candidate at Georgetown. His research interests include linguistic slippage, language coding, and gender performativity in late Victorian realist novels. Number 10, I understood what I did that. And we'll find out. He's doing a paper, a bit of a change from the program, and the title, the new title of his project today is When Words Won't Work, Language, Coding, and the Development of Identity Through Class Positionality in Salvage the Bones. And then we'll hear from Tyler Michaud, okay, I was close. Whose title of his paper is The Failures of Hegemonic Masculinity. And he is a master's candidate also in the English department at Georgetown University. His current interests include the intersection of gender, sexuality, the body, and the institution of the contemporary American family. And then last but not least, we'll be hearing from Carolyn Zuckerman, title of her paper, Cool for You, Experimenting with Class in the Institution. And she's also a surprise, a graduate student in the Department of English, master's also, master's candidate in the Department of English at Georgetown University. Her research interests include the rhetoric of mental health in contemporary women's memoir, as well as writing pedagogy. So I'm thankful that we have such prepared panelists. They have everything ready. It makes me look like I know what I'm talking about. But I'll have hopefully some comments and brief comments, I think, afterwards, and we'll hopefully have a great discussion. So why don't we begin? And also, this is being live streamed. I'm sure this has been mentioned 100 times already, but this is being live streamed, so hopefully everyone's okay with that. I do have forms if you have them. So we'll start with going in order with Toby.
All right, thank you. So this is When Words Won't Work, Language Coding and the Development of Identity Through Class Positionality in Salvage the Bones. Traditional forms of language with vocabulary and grammatical restrictions serve to aid in the transference of information, but the language of individuals of different classes, however, varies greatly based on upbringing and societal factors. Basil Bernstein, the British sociologist, sought to explain these variations through the concept of coding, wherein members of a societal group employ a shared language, and that language both creates and is created by the defining factors of that group. Two types of language coding appear. Elaborated coding indicates words and patterns understandable to anyone because of their necessity and inability to be condensed, and restricted coding refers to language accessible solely to insiders of limited groups like those in specific social classes. Bernstein believed these codes could help explain class distinctions and development of hierarchical understandings of class positionality. Quote, clearly one code is not better than another. Each possesses its own aesthetic, its own possibilities. Society, however, may place different values on the orders of experience elicited. maintained and progressively strengthened through the different coding systems, end quote. Contemporary American society absolutely does this privileging of one language code over others. The coding of upper and middle class white individuals has become synonymous with sophisticated and proper English, and the coding of marginalized groups is seen as improper, incoherent, and to a certain extent uncivilized. Exploration of lexical differences between social groups, then, could lead to fruitful revelations about the development of social class structures. Basil Bernstein, followed by later sociolinguistics, including Regaya Song, explored the verbal expression of these different codes in adolescence and the impact of the education system upon their development. The variances in language coding between age groups and different developmental stages correlated to the differences among social classes. While these sociologists focused on vocalized coding, the presentation of different codes in the written word, both in characters' dialogue and the narrative of autobiographical and fictional authors, reveals the truth that all language is in fact a restricted code. Wittgenstein's theory of a private language helps to illustrate this point in that private interpretation of the world through language is impossible to convey to others. Fiction, in its necessitating the reader to create their own version of the world developed in the narrative, best captures this linguistic reality. Authors present language codes for their characters and show their performance of identity within the fictional world developed while simultaneously performing their own class positionality in choosing to construct a narrative and publish it for the world to interact with. While the elaborated codes of language transcend class and other identity markers, since certain aspects of life are universally expressible and understandable outside of societally determined class markers, ultimately all language is restricted in the highly subjective experiences that exist in an inexpressible space, such as pain or grief. These verbal shortcomings render language itself a restricted code for everyone. The sociolinguist Abram de Swan states that, quote, almost every conceivable opinion, almost any human sentiment is expressed in English. There is no language that more fully reflects the variety of human experience, end quote. The ability to access the full potentiality of language, and English in particular, allows an individual to communicate their thoughts, feelings, and desires to others. However, de Swan includes the qualifier almost in his assertion, and even the most sophisticated speaker cannot capture the total complexity of a lived human experience within the confines of language. Many people will realize the pervasiveness of these shortcomings, but certain groups have better access to them. Marginalized individuals have a unique understanding and awareness of the limitations of language. The act of marginalization shows a privileging of the restricted code of a hegemonic group, white, middle, and upper class, over the restricted code of the marginalized group. Members of these groups face constant reminders that, societally, their language does not carry the same weight and power. Patriarchal language foregrounds one gender over others with descriptions of femininity, fragility, and weakness, and English places whiteness over other racial determiners in its default status. This holds true for any marginalized group, but is magnified through the overarching category of class. This becomes evident in the literature produced by and for working class individuals. In contemporary American authors of working class texts have continued this exploration of language. Jesmyn Ward does this explicitly in her 2011 novel, Salvage the Bones. In the novel, Ward immediately references As I Lay Dying to lead the reader to a consideration of linguistic structure and whether words in the novel would get at what they are trying to say at. The novel's protagonist, Esh, feels an affinity for the text since she was the only one in her classroom to understand Vardaman's meaning when he states, "My mother is a fish." Through this small instance of intertextuality, the author guides the reader to pay attention to the usage of words and consider who can speak, what they can say, and what is lost from those who do not have these opportunities. Ward raises several questions about class language and communication throughout the text. She often shows a failure or inability to communicate from Esh and others using traditional methods, but linguistic variation, semiotic slippage, and nuanced portrayals of affect lead to more fruitful modes of expression. Difficulties and complexities arise not through a lack of education that political rhetoric so often uses to render working class individuals less than at fundamental levels, but rather in human attempts to translate a seemingly untranslatable lived experience, animal-human relationships that exist within the notion of bare life, and a willingness to expose withheld secrets and truths that appear almost ubiquitously in working class texts. Like many aspects and points of analysis for the novel, language itself is foregrounded in the depiction of mothers in Salvage the Bones, which furthers this intertextuality with As I Lay Dying and Addie's suspicion of words that she expresses. Ward privileges the language and expressive capabilities of mothers and shows Esch's struggle to reach for these and ultimately falling short. Ward does not necessarily highlight the faults of language here, but instead emphasizes the difficulties in using language to build a desired identity, or in Esch's case, a required new identity in the revelation of her pregnancy. For Esch, Mama had a command of words that heightened her maternal skills, which she too wants to attain, and this appears directly in her combination of words. Quote, "It made me, Esch, wonder if there were other words that Mama mashed like that. They used to pop up in my head sometime when I was doing the stupidest things. Tetrified, beloved, frigid," end quote. Conventional English is not enough to properly capture certain feelings and impressions, so they've created their own terms. During the hurricane, Esch and Skeeta discuss their mother's last words, and when Skeeta professes an inability to remember her voice, Esch ruminates, quote, "I want to say that I know her voice. I want to open my mouth and have her voice slide out of me like an impression, to speak Mama alive for him as I hear her, but I can't," end quote. She does not merely invoke the memory of her mother to comfort her brother, but hopes to conjure her words and intonations surrounding those incredible feelings. The voice of her mother that Esch yearns for transcends literal sonority and corresponds to a more literary definition. She needs her words to match the strength of her mother's, but she fails to speak Mama alive for him. Ward illustrates that the act of creating life cannot occur through mere words, but demands pain, physical endurance, and visceral moments that are only approximated in language. As a working poor individual, this need to experience motherhood rather than simply state it is abundantly evident since Esch will not have access to paid childcare, and she does not have quick access to a hospital and may need to give birth to her child at the family home. For Jesmyn Ward, the act of giving birth and experiences of being born, a most basic qualifier for life, transcend the confines of language both in their universality and subjectivity. Ward opens the novel with a detailed and startlingly graphic description of birth with the dog China, who has a curious control of communication herself. Political rhetoric often uses comparisons to animals to dehumanize working class and poor individuals. A cornerstone of this flawed argument is that humans use language to communicate, whereas animals only have primitive means of communication. Holly Kate Brown notes how this sense is challenged in the novel. Quote, "Ward's multi-layered pairing of Esch and China resists the social allegory in which comparing a human to a dog inherently reduces the former's status. This resistance happens to such an extent that, having given birth already, China has access to maternal wisdom Esch has yet to acquire. Language is not a true marker of being civilized, and it should not be lauded to the extent that it is because of its shortcomings. The negative comparisons to animals emerges heavily in discussion of someone's poor usage of language, especially English, but Ward subverts the privileging of regular expression even in respect to a dog. China, like Esch's mama, has more to offer through her status of motherhood, and Esch once again yearns for the impossible in wanting quick access to her wisdom. Quote, "China is bloody-mouthed and bright-eyed as Medea. If she could speak, this is what I would ask her. Is this what motherhood is?" End quote. Ward reinforces the idea that this cannot come through words, but has to emerge in the lived experience. The quotation also contains one of the many references to Greek mythology and the character of Medea especially, which solidifies China's wisdom, strength, and maternal knowledge. China's wisdom seems evident to Skeeta as well, and he naturally realizes it in his deep relationship with her. Skeeta watches them, a group of crows, the way he watches China. Like any second she might speak, and he's sure when it will happen, she will reveal all the answers to all the things he has ever wondered about. End quote. Esch imagines that Skeeta wants to be able to hear China speak, but she does not yet realize that the knowledge China has to offer cannot and will not be proffered in words. The truths about motherhood that she knows once again transcend words. Skeeta recognizes that he stands on equal footing with China and welcomes her communication regardless if it comes in literal words that Esch imagines. The novel ends with another moment of speech from China, but this time not in the form of imagined words. Quote, "China will bark and call me sister." After the hurricane, Esch now has the ability to interpret China's expressions, and the eventual act of her child's birth will cement their bond. Significantly, it is through barking that she will express their sororal bond, and English words are not required for that understanding. Esh must go through another birth from the final mother introduced in the novel, Hurricane Katrina, before she can commune with China. The hurricane has the same expressive power as the other mothers, as she, quote, speaks through the hole in the attic roof and funnels wind and rain, end quote. Significantly, the hurricane removes Esh's ability to comprehend what she reads and requires her focus on it, the hurricane, rather than words. I'm trying to read by the oil lamp, but the sound of the words are not coming together over the sound of the wind and the rain relentlessly bearing down on the house. They are fragments. The power to demand to be heard without using words resonates with the power of motherhood, seen continuously throughout this novel and in As I Lay Dying, since it is the word motherhood that Addie notes only arose from the need of someone who had not experienced it to understand what it was. This is perhaps the central struggle for Esh in the entire novel. She knows the word motherhood, but that has not been nearly enough for her to appreciate all that entails. Esh can learn, partly from her class position as a member of a lower class, what it means to be a mother without needing to use any words and their innumerable failures. While China and the memories of her own mother help to guide her toward a greater understanding of the trials of motherhood, Esh requires knowledge from a more elemental and powerful force before her training will be complete. The hurricane deliberately and intimately silences her while she attempts to swim to her grandparents' home. Quote, "Who will deliver me?" And the hurricane says, "Shh." It shushes me through the water with a voice muffled and deep, end quote. Through the experience of the relentless sound and fury from the hurricane, Esh begins to grasp the power of communication that lay beyond words. It can shush and communicate at the same time, and both literally and metaphorically guides Esh to safety from the ravages of the hurricane and an acceptance of her upcoming role and identity as a mother, a bringer of life into the world. The hurricane is also a much more powerful mediator between what she wishes to say and what is actually happening in and to her body while being pregnant. Jesmyn Ward provides much more to unpack and consider on the use of language in the novel. She often treats language with a certain playfulness that shines through both as a reflection of the bookish mind of the narrator and as Ward's own commentary on words and their respective power and weakness. Constantly throughout the novel, characters taste or swallow their words, which creates a strange case of synesthesia to show semiotic slippage and the difficulties of capturing lived experiences in transferable terms. Jesmyn Ward presents the novel in Esh's first-person narration, but she says relatively little out loud in the novel to the other characters. Esh chooses her words carefully when talking, hence the swallowing of those words, and the language patterns seen when she does speak do not match her narration patterns. When addressing those around her, she seems small and contained in her presentation of self. She does not want to offend anyone, and she seems almost afraid to expose her vulnerability and passion, especially in language that could never properly get those across to her addressees. Moreover, she cannot guarantee that the passion and vulnerability will be reciprocated. And in the same way she wishes to commune with China, she wants the others to understand her without having to turn to meek words. The first-person narrative shows a complete and complex interiority where she confidently and eloquently commands language. This resonates with the prose in Vardaman's chapters in As I Lay Dying. While she may not have the exposure to more sophisticated language in her daily life, Esh is an avid reader, and Ward demonstrates that the language used around others does not automatically reflect the language that someone uses in their head as they perceive the world. However, the medium of the novel allows the reader to question whether Ward's narration from Esh reflects the true inner workings of her mind, or if it's Ward's approximation through the use of prose to communicate the more complicated means of interpreting the world that function in the human mind. This also speaks to a class expectations of spoken language contrasted with written language. Esh uses standard English when addressing the reader in the narrative, but in the brief instances when she includes her spoken words, she uses a black vernacular. In Salvage the Bones, Jesmyn Ward presents working-class characters who question and challenge language as a means of communication. Discussion and application of semiotic slippage in linguistic examinations can lend an extra degree of validity and weight to literary analysis of working-class texts. Bernstein's valuation of language through disparate codes aids in showing that no language system or code should dominate any other, but societies do still value certain ones over others, despite the presence of elaborated codes available to anyone. All people could consider that language is inherently faulty and restricted, but working class people face incessant reminders that their language is incapable of capturing all lived human experience. Literature is uniquely suited to highlight societal privileging of certain language codes over others in the deployment of a constructed narrative. Further applications of linguistics to literary analysis can help elucidate even more realities surrounding life as a working class individual. Thank
you. I just remembered, since there's another person not here, you do have like a little extra time. I guess you defer your time to the next person. So that kind of brings us back to being on time since we started like a minute late. Great. I wanted to also, I neglected to mention that I think we're really pushing Twitter this year, sounds like. So if, I know everyone's like, where do we, okay. But if you're on Twitter or you do Twitter, please use the hashtag WCSA18. It's nice. I think the word's getting out, and these days and times we need to, this work that's happening here is actually, I think, more important than ever. So, okay, great. So the next paper we have, again, is will be Tyler.
Close enough. Well, thank you, Toby. It was a great reading of Ward's work. So I will be reading the limitations of hegemonic masculinity in literature of the deindustrialization era. And my voice has been going out today, so if I make a choking sound, I'm all right. I'm just like clearing it. All right. So, Showtime's TV series Shameless first aired in 2011 and is still going. And Justin Torres's novella We the Animals, published in 2011, boasts dynamic young men from poverty and working class backgrounds who resist and challenge their community's ideas of masculinity and purpose in an attempt to achieve independence. Although traditional American poverty and working class masculinities extol the Caucasian, cisgender, heterosexual male as the hegemonic ideal, the young men in these works resist this unforgiving definition of the hegemonic male in order to escape invisibility and thus forge their identities. The purpose of identity, defined as a recognition of oneself, is to prove one's place in the world, not metaphorically, but, to borrow the language of Butler, to live and to avoid dehumanization. Due to the constraints placed upon these young men as a result of deindustrialization, a simple path into manhood is unavailable, and thus the discovery of one's masculinity becomes a sort of bricolage earned, if lucky, by trial and error. This essay examines the role of societal deindustrialization on identity formation in adolescent men by looking at how young men from various ethnic backgrounds and sexual orientations living within economically depressed communities establish their masculinity when the resources, for instance, role models and jobs, which normally aid their development, are no longer available. That is, if masculinity is prescribed via the tools and practices provided by industrialized society, how do men construct identity and prove their existence as productively male while the United States becomes increasingly deindustrialized? For poverty and working class adolescent men, it appears that achieving masculinity is not accomplished by embracing nor rejecting community or its compulsive norms. Instead, these young men must locate and come to terms with their own constructed versions of masculinity, even and especially if those fall beyond the expectations of family, friends, and the larger community. Before late 20th century deindustrialization, U.S. economies were structured to produce a male wage worker, female domestic worker couple. This male-female binary compounded the father-son and mother-daughter mentorships that reinforce compulsory heterosexuality, defined as an imposed order, that reproduces male-female sexual relationships and privileges them in their signifiers. Men were expected to provide for their families by laboring and earning money, and it was here, in capitalism, that the idea of contemporary masculinity was produced. The laboring father played an essential role in the development of their son's identity. As such, the loss of jobs caused by deindustrialization deprived poverty and working class men of the resources relied upon to attain socially sanctioned masculinity. Mature men often could not find work, and this, unfortunately, then deprived sons of the expected father-son mentorship. For these men, the masculine ideal involves possessing a job, a wife, a family, a house, and a functioning body. Without work or purpose, the fathers in these texts are problems without solutions. For instance, Shameless follows the Gallaghers, a mostly white, impoverished family headed by the alcoholic and arguably narcissistic father, Frank. In Weedy Animals, Torres presents the semi-chronological memories of the narrator and his two older brothers growing up in a so-called dysfunctional Puerto Rican family in upstate New York. On the narrator's 7th birthday, Ma is hospitalized because Pa assaults her. Although Pa tells the boys, quote, "The dentist had been punching on her after she went under. He said that's how they loosen up the teeth before they rip them out," end quote. Afterward, Ma asks the narrator to stay 6 forever, saying that big boys are aggressive, they, quote, "smash things," end quote. Not only is Ma perpetuating the cycle of aggression in hegemonic masculinity, boys will be boys, if you will, but she also implores the narrator to stay 6, a child, if only to avoid becoming like Pa, her abusive husband. In this depiction, as well as Shameless, for poverty and working class boys, becoming like one's father is often more grim than ideal. Without respectable fathers to regard as role models, these poverty and working class adolescents look beyond their fathers to other accessible men for guidance into manhood. It's for this reason that the role of siblings, friends, and mentors becomes central to the development of masculine identities in deindustrialized societies. Originally published in the Journal of Social Issues in 2003, the study Sowing the Seeds of Violence in Heterosexual Relationships explores the role of compulsory heterosexuality in adolescence. Unsurprisingly, teenage boys describe that to prove that they are sexually active is to validate themselves. More interestingly, sorry, I lost my spot. I was trying to, plug it in. Unsurprisingly, teenage boys describe that to prove their manhood by engaging in public heterosexual behavior, e.g. dating and kissing, is to increase their popularity. And the girls in the study add that boys lie about their sexual prowess to impress not potential sexual partners, but their male friends, to be perceived as ostensibly normal. To be perceived otherwise, for others to believe that one lacks the privileged sexual experience, is to be abnormal or unintelligible. As Butler explains, quote, that no recognition as human is forthcoming because the norms by which recognition take place are not in your favor, end quote. Of course, the pressure for men to mold their bodies and mannerisms to meet the expectations of traditional masculinity and the shame that inflicts those unable to do so comes largely from other men. When a young man submits to the expectations placed upon him, and of course he feels that he must, he conforms, or rather performs, for the gaze of the omniscient male, and thus puts himself in the exhibitionist and masochistic role that society has ordinarily reserved for women. On that account, the crux of the problem of hegemonic masculinity is its paradoxical demand that men emasculate themselves to achieve manhood and acceptance. In this way, the common expression, "a man's man," has a more cynical definition. Man owns man, or even men are men for men. As Gary Dowsett notes in Wussies and Willies, hegemonic masculinity is, quote, not just successful, athletic, beautiful, and powerful, it's desirable, and being desirable implies a passivity, end quote. Impersonation, therefore, becomes problematic for these characters. I will also trace the semiotics of gayness in the gendering of male youths, and why gayness seems diametrically opposed to the standards set forth by poverty and working class communities. Because hegemonic masculinity is emphatically heterosexual, gay masculinities, whether literal or symbolic, are subordinated. For instance, despite the inherent contradiction, it's common for metrosexual men to be called gay. Given that the semiotics of gayness are blind to sexuality, meaning they also affect cisgender heterosexuals, they play an important role in the way that poverty and working class men present themselves and judge one another. For all men barred from achieving socially sanctioned masculinity, other masculinities are achievable, but they are always perceived as less desirable and unconventional. The valuing of masculinity guarantees that certain men, specifically men identifying or identified as a minority, will either have a more difficult time or will never achieve the hegemonic masculinity of their community. Despite this, the men in these texts persevere and ultimately embrace their otherness in order to achieve a version of palatable masculinity. The setting of Shameless, the Chicago South Side, appears to lack any traditionally respectable masculine figures, and thus Lip, the eldest Gallagher's son, looks beyond the Chicago South Side as soon as he can. Early in the series, Lip is taken under the wing of a male faculty member at the University of Chicago who implores Lip to go to college. This relationship is only a flash in the pan, in part because Lip finds the professor's abuse of power, uses his authority to sleep with female students, skeevy. However, Lip is quick to find another male mentor, Professor Ewens, at the fictional Polytechnic Institute of Chicago. Lip becomes a TA for Ewens, and Ewens becomes a father figure, mentor, and drinking buddy for Lip. Unfortunately, Ewens steals Lip's scholarship and publishes it in an academic journal in his own name, leading Lip to believe that Ewens is only a thieving drunk like Frank, and thus forcing him to return home. Significantly, both of these distinctively middle-class mentors fail Lip, severing his connection to any male role models outside of his impoverished hometown. And without any other options, Lip returns to the Chicago South Side, where he develops a drinking problem, and thus following in Frank's footsteps and perpetuating the cycle of impoverishment and failed traditional masculinity. Concerning his little brother Carl, toxic male influences literally lead to his pursuit of body modification. Carl finds a mentor in his girlfriend's father, a police officer. At first, the officer thinks Carl is a simple delinquent, but after a change of heart, he helps Carl apply to military school, which he ultimately gets into, and it shapes Carl physically, socially, and mentally. Around the same time, Carl also considers getting circumcised, but it is only after talking with his father and brothers that he learns that he is the only uncut Gallagher. This, coupled with the fact that his brothers have proudly received oral sex and that Carl is still a virgin, persuades Carl to undergo circumcision. In both of these events, Carl's physical body is reshaped either directly or indirectly by the influence of his brothers, the officer, and the traditionally masculine military academy. If we also consider Kev, a friend and neighbor of the Gallaghers, and his sudden success and popularity as a stripper at a gay club, which I'll expand on later, it is clear that poverty and working class masculinities are substantiated by the influence and gaze of men. In each instance, the heterosexual man's belonging to the masculine community is validated or invalidated by the gaze of the men around him. For gay men, understanding the male gaze in relation to one's gayness is also a mode of survival. Shameless's Ian and Mickey, who are gay and dating for much of the first 7 seasons, present themselves as a traditionally, toxically masculine. For instance, while the two are dating, they often wrestle and beat each other up moments before having sex, as if preemptively bolstering their respective manhoods. At times, Mickey chastises Ian for acting effeminate because the standard for male identity in poverty and working class communities demands, as Wendell Ricketts notes in Everything I Have Is Blue, masculinity, and lots of it. As such, Ian and Mickey display their bodies in proudly masculine ways. For instance, Ian works out and diets constantly. In certain episodes, his self-care is even presented as an obsession, albeit as well as a marker of his bipolar disorder. Although intense vanity is often considered a gay trope, in Ian's case, his self-care is defined early by his desire to be in the military. With this information, viewers are asked to forgive Ian's vanity as a masculine act. Moreover, Ian assumes a dominant sexual position in his relationship with Mickey, thus seemingly requiring his presentation of gayness to be less extravagant than the latter's. As Ricketts plainly states, masculinity means insertion. Meaning, Ian does not have to go to this same aggressive and violent extremes that Mickey must to be recognizably masculine. For Mickey, he will never achieve his father's ideal version of masculinity because a heteronormative sexual practice is integral. When Terry stumbles upon Ian and Mickey having sex, Terry is so distressed that he hires a prostitute to, quote, fuck the faggot out of him, end quote. To bolster the rumors that came of this, Terry tells his buddies that Ian raped Mickey because to him, that is less of an affront to Mickey's manhood than willingly engaging in gay sex. Considering his father's extreme homophobia, it's unsurprising that Mickey has sex with women to prove himself as a man, because he perceives a fissure between his sexuality and his masculinity. Luckily for Mickey, not everyone in his community has the same standard for masculinity as his father. After Mickey comes out, Kev invites Mickey to enjoy a drink at the bar. Kev is my favorite person, by the way. I'm sure you picked up on that. After Mickey comes out, Kev invites Mickey to enjoy a drink at the bar. Quote, "Mickey, have a seat, man. Nobody gives a shit who you're banging." End quote. Because of Mickey's beliefs, Kev's approval is a significant moment for him. A heterosexual working class man has granted him recognition as a man who can sit down and have a drink with other men in the community. And this moment is when Mickey begins to understand and cope with his own assembled version of masculinity, as well as his place in this particular community. In We the Animals, the Puerto Rican and gay narrator's masculinity is doubly invalidated by his father and brothers. Initially, the brothers are bonded over the fact that Pa believes that all of his sons are unconventionally masculine, since being a purebred Puerto Rican, is central to his ideal version of masculinity. However, when the eldest brothers come to terms with their own mixed ethnicities and thus feel secure in their manhood, they find a reason to exclude the narrator because he is more effeminate. Of course, since the narrator's family views him as effeminate, he feels pressure to perform a sort of ironic, melodramatic masculinity when around his fathers and brothers. Consider when Pa compliments him on his rapid growth and the narrator straightens his back and, quote, broadens his shoulders triumphantly, end quote. This response in hindsight is made more insincere when Pa singles the narrator out and calls him pretty, adding, quote, now isn't that an odd thing for a father to think about his son, end quote. The narrator's perceived effeminacy plays a significant role in an especially jarring scene involving the boys being forced to watch a father-son pornographic film by a neighborhood boy, during which the narrator recalls the many different moments he and his brothers are seen, the word repeated numerous times, together as a single voyeuristic unit. We, boys, we had always seen so much. The narrator then thinks, why won't you look at me, my brothers? Why won't you take my eyes? The repetition of me and my alongside you demonstrates that the brothers, including the narrator, are no longer a single unit. In this moment, although the narrator's brothers are still a single unit, they are still a singular you, the narrator has been removed. He yearns for the comforting gaze of his brothers because his own identity, his belonging to this unit, is dependent on their gaze. By the end of the novella, the eldest brothers are still described as separate from the narrator. They are, quote, the boys. Meanwhile, the narrator, who has been institutionalized by his parents and thus actively made object, is separate from his brothers and no longer included in the unit of the boys. By the end, the narrator is estranged from his family and he is only capable of finding happiness and identity among unrelated strangers. To use the language of the final chapter, the narrator is the prince of a new pack of animals. For gay men in poverty and working class communities, the male gaze not only validates or invalidates their manhood, but being aware of the male gaze in relation to one's gayness is beyond desire and sexuality. It is a way of survival. It is obvious that the gay men in these works must understand how the heterosexual male gaze reacts to their presence at all times. Moreover, the always appraising male gaze limits the acquisition of certain versions of masculinity, forcing some men onto non-linear partial paths towards personal recognition and identity. For the narrator in We the Animals, he is barred from the heritage of Puerto Rican masculinity due to his sexuality, and he is also barred from gay masculinity, which values white men highest, according to Ricketts. Quote, ethnic masculinity, while highly attractive, is incompatible with real gay life, end quote. Young men rely on men for admittance into the masculine community, yet those who are available to look toward for guidance also suffer the issues of unemployment and identity that produce unconventional masculinity. Consequently, by regarding these men as role models, young men assimilate the qualities of unconventional masculinity. In the future, I hope that this will turn out to be an advantage, since tyrannical, hypermasculine fathers would inevitably cease to oppress their sons. But in the meantime, young men must stumble their way through a labyrinth of dysfunctional ideologies in an attempt to achieve a fractured wholeness of self. For Shameless is Kev, arguably the most inspiring, queerly masculine character in either of these works. The realization that gay men who fetishize working class manhood find him attractive confirms his claim to rugged heteronormative masculinity. Since the path to traditional masculinity is overgrown and dismal, Kev pioneers his own path, and in doing so, he stands out, ironically, as a successful male figure. Kev, however, cannot easily supplement the traditional paternal mentorship sought after by the Gallagher boys and Mickey, because his masculinity is not the expected, ostensibly moral, heteronormative guidance they need. In essence, poverty and working class men must become a different kind of survivor by defining their own path to masculinity, because deindustrialization prevents them from duplicating the motions of past generations. When we finally come to terms with our bodies and learn to accept them for what they are, we are not, as is commonly thought, being true to ourselves, but learning how to live with or at a distance from our prescribed gender. For young men, the tensions defining hegemonic masculine ideals create confusing and isolating environments in which they must produce themselves. Identifying oneself is a matter of life and invisibility, and there is no avoiding it. To fail means to be called unreal. The thought of living a possible life becomes a necessity for these young men to survive. and without a finite path to manhood, working class men must seize any opportunity to imagine an opening for themselves to become possible. In the literature of the deindustrialization era, the only way for young men to rescue themselves from their role as, to use Amber Holloway's term, a throwaway people, is to break the conventions of bygone masculinities from within and beyond their communities.
Thanks.
Wow, that's to check out Shameless. I
Yeah.
haven't seen it. Cool. Thank you. Hey, and then of course we have Aaron Zuckerman's Cool for You experimenting with class in the institution.
So listening to Tyler and Toby, those were great readings. Now I'm going to present a reading on Eileen Miles' Cool for You. In the opening pages of Cool for You, Eileen Miles delves into a series of recollections from her job as a nurse's assistant for the Fernald School, an institution for intellectually disabled adults. She describes her interactions with the residents of the North Building, of their behavioral issues, exposition, nudity, and emission of bodily fluids. In one memorable moment, Miles describes herself, quote, 22 years old, mopping up the huge turds of a beautiful young autistic boy. I only wondered sadly if I shouldn't be someplace else, end quote. In a recent Rolling Stone interview, Miles reveals that these opening sections, packed with similarly graphic descriptions to the huge turds, nearly jeopardized the novel's publication in 2000. Publishers questioned why she did not start the work in a more hopeful place, as was conventional for memoirs. More significantly, though, they recoiled at the persistent, quote, smell of human shit on the wall, at the resident who, quote, pissed right on the floor, end quote, urging Miles to begin her work elsewhere, or to remove the sections on the Fernald School entirely. They reacted to descriptions of bodily fluids, and ultimately, of intellectually disabled persons, with disgust, and they sought to separate themselves from it all by not reading about it. According to Miles, the inclusion of this unpleasant content conveyed the reality of, quote, stinky institutions, end quote, like the Fernald School, institutions that did not afford the hope and possibility associated with beginnings of conventional narratives. With this explanation, Miles suggests that such institutions trap those who interact with them. As readers, we might read her depressing, unconventional opening as a means of critiquing institutions for doing so. In the case of the Fernald School, for trapping the residents in the theses-filled space. However, we might also consider that Eileen, 22 years old, feels limited by her role in the institution as well, expressing that she, quote, wonders sadly if she shouldn't be someplace else, end quote. With this sentiment, young adult Eileen reasons that due to her positionality, she may very well belong in the Fernald School, cleaning fluids and caring for autistic adults. Therefore, the beginning of Cool for You might also signal that Eileen does not have a full range of appealing possibilities from which to choose, and that subsequently, a nonfiction account of her life would not consist of a hopeful progress narrative. However, it is worth examining the cause of Eileen's sense of limitation, her working class positionality within the social structure. This positionality, I will explain, classes her distinctly below the professionals who run the institution, but above the intellectually disabled residents, despite their potentially different socioeconomic statuses. The Fernald School, meanwhile, serves as a place where Eileen interacts extensively with residents while implementing the psychiatrist's, quote, behavioral modification, end quote, program. In other words, it is an in-between or liminal space where a working class Eileen engages with the even more downwardly classed residents. I will argue that during these encounters, Eileen experiences moments of identification with the residents, of temporary downward mobility. Cool for You, a genre-ambiguous work, has long been regarded as experimental due to its nonlinear narrative structure. However, I would also suggest that the experimental quality of this work extends to her treatment of class identity through Eileen's attempts to occupy other class positions. Class, then, becomes part of Miles's experiment. First, it is necessary to define Eileen's position in greater detail, particularly in the context of her bosses and the residents. I have alluded to this disgust that Miles' publishers express while simply reading about the residents. Those in charge of the Fernald School occupy a similar upper-middle class position and likewise distance themselves as much as possible from the residents. These politicians and scientists do not enter the residences. Instead, they meet at a shiny facility at the front of the grounds, according to Miles. On rare occasions, the Harvard psychiatrists who design the programs visit the relatives, and they do so with undisguised disgust. With this reaction, they class themselves as superior to the residents, as well as to anyone who maintains a close proximity to them. Eileen's job as a nurse's attendant falls within the caring economy, which, according to Tamara Drought, is one of the 4 largest sources of jobs for the working class. In the past, females provided such labor for their relatives, but as more people moved into the middle class, the job, according to Drought, was outsourced to the lowest status women in our society, who are poorly paid. In addition, the presence of bodily fluids also classes Eileen work as labor, quote, dealing with things that smell or prefer to hide from view, quote, becomes categorized as low status, both monetarily and socially. Therefore, middle and upper class workers, such as the psychiatrists and publishers, look down upon Eileen's labor due to its characterization as women's work and her proximity to the defecating, urinating residents. Still, Eileen uses her skills to labor in the economy, which distinguishes her from the Fernald School residents and positions her above them in the social structure. According to David Harvey, this process is essential to capitalism, wherein, quote, the laborer, a person, sells labor power, a commodity, to the capitalist to use in the labor process, end quote. To do so requires that capitalists draw on the skills and mental capacities of the labor power, that which is extracted from the body of the laborer as a commodity. Then the value of laborers is a value based on their productiveness in the system, but also in their role as consumers of capital. In this case, the psychiatrists draw on Eileen's skills in order to maintain functioning of the school and implement their program. In contrast, the residents, intellectually disabled adults, do not have the mental labor power to produce surplus in this capitalist system, nor can they act as, quote, rationalist consumers, end quote, as they are not considered, quote, rational humans. Thus, the residents are viewed as unable to function in society and are essentially classed as the lowest rung of society. This class position comes with a host of associations: ugliness, immorality, and lack of discipline. According to sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, taste comes from social class, and the middle class, or upper middle class, has long labeled distasteful what it deems dirty, repulsive, noisy, contaminating. Then it has defined itself through the, quote, exclusion of what it marks low, end quote, and seeks to remove from the sight of society. Bodily grossness certainly qualifies as low, which includes uncontrolled defecation and urination in an equation of the lower bodily stratum to lower social classes. From a middle class perspective, the Fernald School residents lack not only labor power, but also lack the ability to control their gross bodies. Therefore, they must be hidden from society in institutions like the Fernald School. However, institutions have another function. According to Marx and Foucault, they act as a disciplinary apparatus of surveillance, punishment, and ideological control. The Fernald School then seeks to control the residents' bodies as well as impart, as much as possible, capitalist values through a behavioral modification program implemented by nurses' attendants. Eileen describes how she and the other attendants would sound buzzers every 15 minutes and check for exposed genitalia. If a resident were clothed, Eileen would reward him with a chocolate star, an M&M, and later tokens. As residents learned to clothe themselves in exchange for a reward, the attendants would then teach the residents more advanced good behavior, such as cleaning floors and making beds. According to Eileen, the psychiatrists hoped that men would begin to understand money, that they would become rational consumers of capital. Unsurprisingly, Eileen remarks, it did not work. The residents had entered Fernald School in large part because their minds were not regarded as rational. Though the behavioral modification program could teach them modesty, it could not teach them rationality or how to become useful in a capitalist society. For this reason, many men stayed in the institution for decades. Within her role, Eileen occupies a complex in-between class position. On the one hand, she holds a working class caring job, but on the other, she contributes her labor power, working to implement a modification program that, quote, wrote cultures, codes, and values on the minds and bodies of the residents, end quote. From her position, she can express the same disgust as psychiatrists. The difference is that she cannot distance herself from the residents in the way that the psychiatrist can. At times, Eileen does express disgust. For instance, she describes being the place as, quote, dying and going to hell, end quote. At another point, she writes about traveling through Western Massachusetts, which, quote, has a poor white trash look, which I associate with the insane, end quote. Here, Eileen does not directly reference the residents of Fernald School, but she does equate the lowest class of white people with the intellectually disabled, indicating her own perceived class superiority. In other moments, however, she refers to residents in rather empowering terms. She compares resident Bobby Doyle to a beautiful centaur, and another to Napoleon. Eileen also portrays Bobby's nudity in a more flattering light, describing how he'd like to undress and, quote, get down on the cool bathroom tiles and curl up on the porcelain of the toilet. She goes on to explain that she, quote, knew how it felt. Don't you, nights when you're drunk and you lie flat under the powerful light in the ladies' room, and it is the only safe place in the world? Eileen renders his behavior not as gross, but as recognizable, likening it to her own. And with the don't you question, she also beckons the reader to see it as familiar as well. In this moment, Eileen not only refuses to express a class distancing reaction of disgust, but she also identifies with Bobby Doyle's behavior. However, other moments of identification with the residents trouble Eileen, particularly when she considers consuming the institutional food. She expresses disgust at the food itself, making it explicit that the food, including the, quote, huge vats of watery oatmeal and the beige sand-colored coffee is, quote, shit. But the food represents a certain social class identity. It is so mechanical that she claims it is anyone's food, meant for a depersonalized collective. However, Eileen longs to consume it, to be, quote, one of them, end quote, to occupy their position just for a moment. Her longing, though, is fraught with anxiety. She wants to be one of them, but she also knows that entails, quote, forgetting who you were, becoming part of a marginalized, invisible group. Despite her ambivalence, she does drink half a cup of the coffee, an action met with looks of disgust from her co-workers. This disgust may be evidence that by consuming the coffee, she has become one of them, even if for the few seconds of sipping coffee. Perhaps her co-workers' disgust could also come from bewilderment that in the space where Eileen holds a superior class position, she has chosen to downgrade to the position of the residents, a place that brings no societal privileges. The attendants maintain very little physical distance from the residents, but their class identities, to a certain degree, grant them separation. Though it brings her anxiety, Eileen chooses out of her own volition to identify with them on some level, to close the remaining distance between her and the residents. At this point, it is important to examine exactly why Eileen might want to occupy their position. When reflecting on her choice of employment, Eileen reveals, quote, I was delighted to be inside an institution, and not because I was nuts. My father's mother, Nellie Miles, had spent the last 17 years of her life at Westboro State Hospital. I had always wanted to go inside anything, so Fernald would do, end quote. In this quotation, Eileen expresses, one, a desire to be inside an institution, and a delight at the opportunity to do so, and two, a personal connection to the institution, as her paternal grandmother, Nellie, had spent the last portion of her life in an institution for the mentally ill. To Eileen, Nellie represents somewhat of a mysterious figure, as she passed away when Eileen was only 7 years old. More significantly, Eileen remembers her mother forbidding her from entering the mental hospital, from, quote, stepping beyond the tulips of the place, end quote, in the face of disgust her mother would make upon returning from inside. These fragmented memories stir Eileen's curiosity about institutions, as well as about Nellie herself, who Eileen describes as the heart of the family. By working at the Fernald School, Eileen may feel a greater connection to Nellie's experience. Though Nellie is mentally ill, not intellectually disabled, she too exists in a society that views her as lacking a rational mind. Nellie occupies a similar social position as the Fernald men's school men do, and she lives in a space that elicits similar reactions of disgust. For Eileen, consuming institutional food might present an additional means of accessing Nellie's class positionality. While I've suggested that Eileen's act of sipping the institutional coffee has implications for her social identity, I would also like to explore the degree to which it allows her to meaningfully inhabit their and Nellie's position. When Eileen consumes the coffee, she drinks out of the same scratched cups as the residents do, though it is unclear whether or not Eileen drinks the remnants of a resident's coffee or pours a cup for herself. The act does bring her into close contact with the resident's gross bodily fluids. If she drinks after a resident, Eileen directly shares his saliva. But if she does not, she still drinks out of a cup that has, quote, lived its life in institutions, quote, a reusable cup that has touched the lips of many residents. The sips of coffee elapse all distance between her and the residents, but that does not mean that the coffee allows her to become a resident. First, the experience of drinking coffee lasts only a few minutes or a few moments. After Eileen takes her last sip, she resumes her role as an attendant, enforcing the behavioral modification program. The issue is not necessarily brevity itself, but that the brevity represents her ability to transition back into her superior social position. The residents do not have this privilege of movement. Also, without her attendant job, Eileen would not have had come into contact with the coffee. The reason that Eileen enters the space is because she possesses the labor power that psychiatrists can use to implement their program. The act of consuming coffee, while intimate, offers her a brief and incomplete experience of identifying the low-class social position. And it is important to emphasize that it is an identification with, not an occupation of, the social class of the institutionalized population. Later in life, though, Eileen attempts to identify with Nellie's experience in another way, by reconstructing her life. 4 decades after Nellie's death, Eileen requests medical records from the Westboro State Hospital wanting to know Nellie's story. Here the word story is operative. Eileen wants to recover her documents and understand Nellie's experience, place herself in it. However, when she receives the medical records, Eileen laments the number of inconsistencies in the report, the mixed information about Nellie's life, including an erroneous death date for one of her sons. She remarks that, quote, Massachusetts is so formal in its uncaring, quote, about the details of Nellie's existence that it did not even consider her a real person. When a nurse's note, reading a nurse's note that Nellie seems happy, Eileen calls the nurse's caring cruel because it singled Nellie out for a moment as if it were a real life. This criticism marks Eileen's most explicit attack on institutions for oppressing their institutionalized population. In these spaces, she adds corrected details to the empty narrative provided by the state about the son who did not die so prematurely, and even about the death of Nellie's daughter, which drove her into mental illness. We could read her reconstruction as restorative, as righting the state-sanctioned injustice. However, particularly when Eileen describes Nellie, quote, calling her daughter's name again and again and again, she is not merely filling in missing facts, but rather reimagining events from Nellie's perspective. The act of writing Nellie's life, then, might be another attempt to occupy her social position. However, I would still resist the notion that the act of reconstructing Nellie's narrative allows her to fully inhabit her social position. While the act of drinking coffee lasted a few minutes, the act of writing was a sustained labor. Despite the more exhaustive effort, I would argue that Eileen, even when attempting to understand Nellie's perspective, still writes as Eileen, because Nellie could not write a record for herself. In addition, Eileen remarks, Eileen spelled backwards is Nellie. Though some might read this as Eileen identifying with Nellie, I would consider her identifying Nellie with Eileen. Her portrayal of Nellie is sympathetic, but at the same time, it is still Eileen's rendering of her. Eileen even remarks, quote, the state's picture of my family are no more erratic and conventional than our own, quote. Within the span of Cool for You, the writing of Nellie's life constitutes Miles' last experiment with class positionality, one that brings a sustained, intimate experience of identification with her grandmother, but not one that fully transcends class boundaries. Thank
you. Find out, is Nellie a resident? Is that like the twist at the end or something? Okay. Very interesting. I don't know why I was asked to chair this panel because I don't do literature so much, but I'm going to give it a shot. I learned a lot, and I want to leave time for questions. Of course, it's so interesting, all of the papers, and I think you guys are all on the way to doing some great work, already doing great work. I just wrote down a few notes that, as a non-specialist that stood out to me that might be helpful. I think it's always helpful when you're giving papers to say what you're going to say, in the beginning. If somebody did that, it helps, I think, because you never know who's listening and so forth. And always there's always, I remember this, right? There's always an assumption that everyone knows the books, or we tend to present the work in a way where the knowledge is already assumed, and so I think the exposition on all the papers was really helpful, right? To say this is what these books are about and stuff and what you're going to argue, and it's really, really interesting. For Toby's paper, I just wrote down a few things. I wrote down code was one thing you mentioned a lot, and you know, coming from linguistics, English as the more official, the more proper, or the more you know, sort of. I think you wrote. I wrote English as sort of interchangeable with whiteness in that sense, and in terms of power dynamics. It's interesting, and I know you were originally going to do a different paper, and I'm wondering why you might decide to change it. Maybe you'll decide to share that with us. But definitely interesting, you know, comparison there between Faulkner and then this other text. I thought, you know, I've heard a lot of really interesting work done on weather, on storms, on, you know, lately there's a lot to be done there in terms of like some of the stuff. Mothers was a theme you mentioned a lot, motherhood. And there was some mention there about the Black vernacular, and I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. I suppose it has something to do with the semiotic slippage that is being referred to, at least in 2 papers here. Very interesting. Tyler's paper, as I said, I got to check out that show now because I hadn't seen it, and it sounds pretty fascinating actually. But I thought you really did a really great job of laying out, you know, what the paper was about for non-specialists. It was really helpful, I mean, for me. Just a lot of great, amazing stuff in this one. I'm not even going to attempt to so much cover it because it was really, you know, one has a sense, and I wrote down some good references. Wussies and Willies. I'm going to have to find out that book. I got to know what that book was about. But also, I thought you might talk a little more about some of the other stuff too. Just sort of the differences. Metrosexual was mentioned as opposed to and God, it just sounds like good work. Body modification, the whole ritualistic thing of getting a beer, that kind of thing. That was really interesting. The other book, the one about Puerto Rican identity. What's it called again? The book that you were talking about.
Oh, sorry. We the Animals.
We the Animal. Thank you. Yeah, that one sounded interesting as well. And I know there's been a lot of work done on Latin masculinity, Latino masculinity, and so forth. And that might be kind of interesting because I think there is an interesting sort of space in that, and culturally speaking, in the Latin American context, for some of that. I don't know how to say it exactly, but it just seems to me to be maybe compared to other cultures. There's a little bit more legitimacy. There's a little bit more of a space in terms of where one can be LGBTQ and also retain one's masculinity. It seems to me. And then the last paper sounds like just full on like interesting. Like I don't know, just the book cool for you. So I'm gonna check this out. I really want to. I have to read this now. Funny stuff too. I went to graduate school in Western Mass, so I have a whole new perspective now of that experience, and yet it resonated. But I thought that was pretty interesting. I didn't know, I wasn't kidding before. I thought there might be some playing there in terms of in institution and who's in the institution, who's out of the institution, who did that. And I thought maybe there might be something there. But the yeah, I think also like my sort of general like take on all the papers is what's the larger takeaway? Where's the connections in terms of again, for non-specialists or not even non-specialists in literature, but just some of those things, because but one gets a sense, a glimpse into this ongoing work that is very complex and privileged, and all of these things were being mentioned. But where can we what can we non-specialists, in my case, take away from the work in terms of like the big idea? You know, what will we remember about it? I thought it was all of it really fascinating, and so I just appreciate the chance to listen to your work, and thank you very much. So I don't know if we had, I'm sure there's some good questions, and oh yeah, a lot of hands. I don't know how you guys do this. I'm new to this, so just roll with it. More to call on.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much, all of you. I'm Michelle. Yeah, my question is for Tyler. Okay, first of all, I haven't read the book, but I did see I don't know if you saw the movie that was based on it.
I didn't even
It's a short that was just shown a couple
Okay.
weeks ago, Maui Film Festival, Film Festival. But anyway, the situation of the narrator character there, in dealing with his sexuality and both his working class background and that Puerto Rican background, to me brings up a problem that I've thought about in working class cultures, that both in working class culture in general, and certainly in Puerto Rican culture, family is paramount.
Right.
And so when you have these two groups that you identify with, and yet they are rejecting of your sexuality, what kind of a situation does that put the narrator in? I don't know if that's something that you can answer. Maybe if the book deals with that in some way.
I feel like that is the main problem in the book, right? The problem is that he's rejected. He's barred from his Puerto Rican masculine heritage because his brothers and his father reject him, and he also can't attain, access to gay masculinity because he's Puerto Rican, and so that's kind of, that's the main problem. And I think the only way that the novel resolves it is he just has to completely start over, right? Which is really depressing to think about. But yeah, at this point, I feel like that's what the novella is telling us.
Yeah, my name's Jeff Brown from Manchester Met. Tyler, I thought they were all three great papers and all beautifully read. It was fabulous. Comment on which one anybody else. So I do focus on Tyler's. My work, I suppose, is what you might call an ongoing ethnography of the deindustrialisation of coal in the UK. So a hyper-masculine setting. So there's a whole bunch of questions keep appearing in that ethnographic work around masculinity. It strikes me that distinction that Connell drew between his earlier work and his later work, where he developed a distinction between hegemonic masculinity as a heroic form and protest masculinity as developing themes of hegemonic masculinity in a context of deindustrialisation, impoverishment, and so on. I think that distinction allows us to make sense of at least what was happening in the British Shameless series, which was set in Manchester, actually. Frank in the British Shameless series is what we would call a waster. He's anti-heroic. You could say that Frank is very much a protest masculinity figure, speaking against the dominant heroic hegemonic masculinity of the generation of men before that. Is a kind of trickster. The sexual fluidity that's surrounding that series is as much about a kind of voracious polymorphousness, if you like, and as a kind of sexual chancellor. It's like anything will do. So that's kind of figure that's being created. And the impact that Shameless had in the UK was not only to speak to dominant narratives that were around generally in society. One of the reasons it landed so abrasively, and the first few episodes were shocking, and it really there was a shockwave ran through, was because it spoke to cherished heroic narratives that are dominant on the left in the UK. And I think equally in my work, I don't know whether this is any help or not, but there's a historical moment that sometime at the end of the 1950s, running into the 1970s, where certainly in coal mining's imagination of itself, something's happens to masculinity, and it shifts across that threshold from heroic to anti-heroic. There's all kind of labour history stuff about refusing work, not wanting to work, dodging work, sabotaging work, not performing heroically, that starts to appear at that time. I've not fully unpacked that, but it kind of fascinates me. One last point. Shameless. So Beverly Scape's position shame as the key disciplinary characteristic of the lived experience of class inferiority. So in a sense, Frank in Manchester is refusing to be shamed. He's shameless. So this is a kind of politicized refusal, whether that's conscious or whether it's not, remains forever uncertain. But positioned in terms of the kind of political autonomism of the 1970s starts to look really quite multi-layered. And that's really relevant to what I'm doing. So I was thoroughly engaged with your paper.
Thank you. That's a ton to think about. I really agree. I'm actually not familiar with the British version of Shameless. I know it exists, but I'm not familiar with it.
Do you know the distinction in Cornwall then? Because I can give you a paper.
No,
I do a paper.
I don't.
Okay.
If you want to enlighten me, I'd love that.
I saw this gentleman.
So I have a question for Caroline, and it's a very broad one. So I'm not familiar with Cool for You. Again, like I think everybody else here, I put it in my Amazon queue while you were talking. So I want to read it as soon as the conference is over. But I'm wondering what makes it experimental. And I'm asking this because it sounds like, based on what you described, it does a lot of kind of translating of these closed off institutions like mental hospitals and prisons for outsiders in a way that uncomfortably plays with the institutional tourist trap, right? Like, I've worked in this place, so let me tell you what it's about. And it seems like that's a very dangerous game to play, especially given your close reading of certain key passages where there's willful identification with the most abject of the institution. I work in prison studies, so like almost half the books that come out about prisoner, let me tell you, when I taught in it 1 week, what a prison is like for those who haven't been inside it. And in terms of like the writing of this stuff, women's mental hospitals are the equivalent of men's prisons, right? So I'm wondering if you could say, does the experimental nature kind of undermine that tourist trap dynamic, or in some way or another, like basically just how is it an experimental book, and like does that mitigate some ways, like translating these closed off institutions for middle and upper class white readers who don't deal with them on a day-to-day basis? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it does. It's experimental, especially in the sense of its form and the style of writing. Non-linear narrative. In a lot of memoirs, it's this conventional, hopeful narrative that's pretty much, it's often a story of class ascent, and that doesn't happen in this memoir. And also she kind of plays with genre lines a lot. She calls it, I think in some interviews, an experimental novel or a nonfiction novel, which definitely shows a lot of hybridity. But the way the story is told, very simple language, grammar mistakes are included. So some of the, I guess, higher English or standard English that is often used in a lot of literature is just not there, and it's a bit more transparent, I think, and does kind of take away that whole tourism of the institution in some ways. In others, though, she's both an insider and an outsider, so I think that's still there. She is kind of like, oh my gosh, I did this once when I was 22 and didn't know what to do. So there is some of it, but I think some of it is removed by the language that she uses and kind of the more experimental qualities of the book, and also with her very intimate identification through her grandmother and being genuinely curious about her life and wanting to reconstruct it, which she sees as an injustice that she just has these medical records that were written for her, not from her. So
she's not solidly from the middle class
Right.
either. I mean,
Yes,
part
she
of her,
mentioned
that's
that
part of
too.
her issue, right?
Yeah,
Is that she feels that sense of falling further down,
Yes.
right? And so she's struggling to figure out how to, she goes to college, but she doesn't finish, right?
Right.
She goes to college for a little bit.
I think it's a good question too. I think there was a lot of bodily fluids stuff happening.
Yeah.
Seems to me that someone, it sort of it speaks to a tourist kind of genre.
Give me the real stuff. I want the rape, the sex, all of that. I mean, that's the middle class desire for these texts to reproduce the bodily fluids, the drug addiction, the sex, all of it.
Middle class fascination with those, whereas a worker would be less fascinated with the mundane aspects of the job. I don't know. It's interesting. Very interesting. Yes.
So I have a comment/question that I think links these papers, because one of the things I feel like I heard through all of them, and I'm sorry, Toby, I wasn't here for the very beginning of yours, so I might be applying something to it that isn't there, so my apologies if I'm doing that, is about the question of class, how class is formed and experienced and enacted through what can be seen and heard. The visibility, the audibility, the intelligibility. So Caroline, you said something, I think I'm hearing this right, that in part the residents of the school are defined as a lower class than the workers.
Right.
Partially because of things that they do.
Right.
And the mess and stink and all that's attached to that. But also by their being hidden away.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Versus what Tyler is talking about of the importance of the gaze as a piece of belonging, which is a theme that I think runs through a lot of the ways that we talk about class culture, versus the notion of what can be heard and what can be understood, and how do people communicate, and how that makes connections, right? So I wonder if each of you guys could talk a little bit about how visibility, audibility, recognition, performance, gaze, all of those things help us understand what class is and how it works. And it's a huge question, but I feel like it's embedded in all of your papers, and it's a way of talking about it that I don't feel like I've heard a lot, so I'd love to hear you say a little bit more.
So I guess my gut reaction to that is when I'm thinking about Shameless specifically, I'm thinking about the ways that so like I said, was saying, Kev is, in my opinion, the most respectable masculine figure in the show. But they can't look to him. Obviously they can look to him physically, they can see what he's like. But if they copy his behavior, they're not doing anything productively masculine. They're just adopting his queer masculine mannerisms. And so I guess that's the right that what you see and what you hear is influencing you. And I, ever an optimist, just want to be okay, so if they, like I said, one day hypermasculine fathers, won't be able to oppress their sons because there will no longer be hypermasculine fathers. Everyone will be queerly masculine. In my optimistic outlook, so that's my reaction to it. So obviously, what you see, what you hear, blah blah blah, is so central to class and how it's formed. And one can hope that one day there will be so much variation because there will no longer be anyone. Right? But there will no longer be a hierarchy of masculinity in this case. That's not the case. It's never going to happen. We'll just replace, how in We the Animals, dancing is seen as a masculine act, but in Shameless, dancing has nothing to do with masculinity. It's non-monolithic. So that's my rambling thought. What about you guys?
All good. So I think audibility and intelligibility, right, and are so often associated with your command of language, right? And to the extent that if you don't have that, then you're automatically deemed less than. And, you know, so I want to argue that audibility and intelligibility is something that transcends language, right? That our communications are more important than words, and there's something more almost primal, right? Which is something going on with the hurricane and with China in Salvage the Bones that I wanted to look at. And so that if we think about that and think about how people of working class individuals are always already assumed to have a lesser command of English, that they're going to be thinking about different ways of being audible and intelligible that are going to point out how those failures of language, right? And so that the class positionality that kind of lower class positionality almost allows you to understand that in a better way to a certain extent.
Creates more options.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot with sound and sight in the Fernald School Institution that Miles refers to quite a bit in this section. For instance, it's a lot of not being able to express full sentences or standard English or whatnot is a lot of what downwardly classes the resonance. And what's interesting is she mentions repetitive sounds that they make versus intelligible words, which again has to do with the mental rationality and ability to be consumers of capital. They can't do that. And then what's also interesting is the sounds of the buzzers and I guess the clicking of the lock of the gates, like this whole walled in hiddenness that's also registered in the sound. Okay, so you can't understand the sentences. Okay, you'll understand the buzzer, and that means you should clothe yourself. Like those are the kinds of sounds being imparted upon the resonance, instead of having some sort of a conversation. So I found that part really intriguing. And kind of similarly, Nellie, Eileen's grandmother, can't have a record for herself. So she just has the nurse's interpretation of her affective state, or her calling her daughter's name again and again, maybe not fully formed sentences, and it's their interpretation of what that might mean in the narrative that she can't construct for herself. And also even Eileen's reimagination of that narrative, she does play the sound that Nellie would make of calling her daughter over and over. Whether that's true to what actually happened or not, we don't know, but it is interesting that she associated kind of the repetition of sounds with both the intellectually disabled population and her mentally ill grandmother in an institution. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 terrific papers. Thank you so much. I think my question, I have a bunch of questions, but I just got one for Toby really quickly. I really loved the paper. This just sort of beginning with this theory of kind of these multiplicity of coding, right? Whether it's capacious or restrictive. But I guess, right, it made me think about Lorenzo Dua, Borderlands of Frontera, that she the wild tongue guy speak multiple languages. But I guess maybe what I'm worried is, right, if class consciousness is going to exist, the need for a shared language or a shared discourse of whether that's exploitation or struggle, right? And I've wondered maybe your thoughts about this, and if there's a way that if these are 3 working class papers, what becomes a sort of shared terms that this is all about, kind of expanding class consciousness and obviously being sensitive to issues of intersectionality.
So I would say that I think you can come to a sort of communicative type of shared consciousness, and I would argue that it wouldn't be in language, right? That it's some other kind of expression. I don't know exactly what it would be, but that's part of the point that I would want to be making, right? Is that it is something beyond words, and that looking at language as, like you said, capacious or restricted, if you look at other forms of communication, it might open that up a bit more for that kind of clash consciousness.
What's beyond language? I'm sorry, this is a really dumb question, but what sort of communication beyond language?
I don't know. Okay. And that's something to further explore.
But your paper, Toby, as far as I mean, except for the other deals with race to some extent. And you did talk a little bit about vernacular, and you talked a little bit about coding and so forth. I wonder if there's maybe an answer there for you.
Right, and so I don't get into code switching for this novel, different types of restricted codes, but I think it would be something to look at. And so I briefly mentioned as she uses this American Black vernacular when speaking, but it's not present in her prose. And then what does Ward try to suggest with that? And I think it is almost a kind of consciousness that perhaps it's a different type of language encoding that could be looked at. And that could also go into something like The Hate You Give that has a more explicit exploration of class coding, right, where the narrator speaks one way at home with her family, but then goes to a private upper class white school and speaks a different way, that could come into this as well.
I guess I know where time is a factor here at this conference, so I think we're going to formally say thank you to all of you.